Welcome to Rica Subtest 2 online test preparation course presented by ricatest.com. Thank you so much for joining us. In this lesson, you will learn everything you need to know about competency 14, and that's how to promote students' comprehension and analysis of narrative texts. To begin, let's define what a genre is. A genre is a category of literature that includes folk tales, which are originally told by word of mouth. They have a moral and they teach a lesson. They explain how something came to be. And the characters can be animals or people, and they do often face immense challenge. And many folktales contain the rule of three, where characters and events seem to happen in threes. Examples of folktales include the Pied Piper, Jack and the Beanstalk, and Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Next, we have modern fantasy. In this genre, stories are often set in the present day or near present day, and they blend realistic aspects with unconventional ones. Examples of modern fantasy picture books include Where the Wild Things Are and Jumanji. Our next genre is high fantasy. Characteristics of high fantasy is that it is a subgenre of fantasy that casts extravagant characters in a massive fictional world that uses extensive detail. Examples of high fantasy include Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Next, we have science fiction. Science fiction typically deals with imaginative and futuristic concepts such as advanced science and technology, space exploration, time travel, parallel universes, and extraterrestrial life. Examples of science fiction include Zeta the Space Girl and Plants vs. Zombies. Contemporary realistic fiction is our next genre, which creates imaginary characters and situations to show our world and our society. Examples include Judy Moody and The Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Next, we have historical fiction, and this describes fictionalized stories that are set in the past. This type of book uses authentic and accurate information, as well as actual historical figures and events. Examples of historical fiction include Finding Langston and Birchback House. Next, we have poetry. And within poetry, that includes ballads, which is a poem or song narrating a story in short stanzas. Short stanzas is a group of lines within the poem. And poetry also includes lyrics. So, lyrics are characterized by expressing personal feeling. For example, a sonnet is a type of lyric poetry. And now we have couplet, which is simply a pair of lines in a poem with two successive lines that rhyme and have the same meter. An epic in poetry is a type of poem that is long in length and tells a story, oftentimes about a heroic deed. Now we have sonnet. And a sonnet is a piece of poetry that has 14 lines that includes a prescribed rhyming scheme. A biography is our next genre, which are informational books that are an account of someone's life that were written by someone else. And lastly, we have an autobiography, which is an account of a person's life but written by that person. Teachers need to teach students about how to recognize these major literary genres, and to do so, we can show them the real examples of different genres so that they can get an understanding for each one. In this section, we'll discuss elements of story grammar and systematic explicit instruction for these elements. The first element of story grammar is the character, who the story revolves around and follows. Teachers need to teach children to identify the protagonist, which is the main good character, and also the antagonist, who is the challenging character. The plot is the next narrative grammar point, which is what happens in a story. Specifically, the plot is the sequence of events that happen. The most common plot structure is introduction, conflict, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. The setting is the time and the place where the story takes place. The mood is largely influenced by the writer's style and is the way the story makes the reader feel. The feeling can arise from the writing style, font choice, color, and more. This might be cheerful, reflective, gloomy, humorous, whimsical, romantic, or many more. The theme of a story is the main idea or underlying meaning of a writer and what they explore in the novel. Common examples include good versus evil, love, redemption, courage, perseverance, coming of age, and revenge. These major elements of a story, when put together, form the story grammar. When presented with a task on your Rica test to teach narrative story grammar elements, use one of the following instructional strategies. You can use a story map or a story grammar outline. A story map is a scaffold that helps students map the story to increase their comprehension of what they read. A story grammar outline carries the same purpose as the story map, which is to help the students identify the elements of a story by taking note and enhancing their reading comprehension skills. An example of a standard story grammar outline looks like this: a simple outline form where the children write the parts of the story as they read or once they're finished reading the story. On your Rica test essays, you will not want to simply hand the children a story map or story grammar outline and say, all right, go complete it. Instead, you'll want to use this method that we've discussed throughout the course. It's called the gradual release of responsibility. And this is when the students use a step by step approach. So, step number one is that the teacher models the demonstration by completing the story map or the story grammar outline for your students to see how you do it appropriately. Now, make sure to use a think aloud approach. The Riga test scores will love it. This is a recurring term. Remember, think alouds are a key term to use for your essays and case study. Then, perhaps in the next story, project the story map or the story grammar outline on the whiteboard or on chart paper, but ask for students to volunteer to come up and fill in the blanks. So this is when the teacher and the students they complete the task together. Then finally, in the third lesson, the teacher lets the students complete the story map or the story grammar outline independently in order to demonstrate their ability to identify the parts of a story. In this next section, you'll learn explicit instructional strategies for narrative analysis. Let's talk about this now. This is the process of interpreting a text and literary criticism. Let's talk about this. This is the practice of judging the parts of a literary text. Your Rica test will prompt you with questions on teaching narrative analysis and literary criticism. Let's follow these 5 needs. First, identify the structural elements of a plot and evaluate their logic and credibility. Remember, we also need to compare and contrast the motivations and reactions of characters. Third, evaluate the relevance of the setting. Fourth, identify recurring themes. And fifth, identify elements of a writer's style, including the function and effect of an author's use for the figurative language. All of this might feel like a lot, but in fact, what you really need to remember for your Rica test is that you will either want to use a story map or a story grammar outline in order to teach narrative analysis. And remember that we always use the gradual release of responsibility model. So when you get asked a question, use the story grammar map or the story grammar outline. And one more time, use the gradual release of responsibility method. You'll do great. All right, now key literary terms. These are often used in the multiple choice section of your Rica test, so let's go over these now. First, we have hyperbole, which is an exaggerated comparison. For example, this bag weighs a ton. Then we have metaphor, and this is an implied comparison, such as his heart is like gold. Next is personification, and this is giving inanimate objects human traits. For example, my stubborn computer is refusing to start up. A simile compares two things by using comparison words such as like, as, so, or than. Let's do an example here. For example, she's always as cool as a cucumber. Within the figurative language category, there are also stylistic devices. And we're going to need to teach our kids these too. First, we have symbolism. Symbolism is when a person, an object, a situation, or an action might actually present itself as one literal thing, but it might be a symbol for another thing altogether. Next, we have imagery. And this is when the five senses are used, including taste, touch, smell, sight, and hearing. Next, there's irony, and this is expression using language that signifies the opposite of what is actually said. An example could be, beautiful weather we're having, huh? When there's a thunderstorm going on outside. Lastly, we have foreshadowing. And this is where future events are hinted by the author. For example, that dark, dark cloud in the back. It's just a small cloud. I'll be fine, this person says. Suddenly, all right, now let's switch to oral language activities for our students. Books are excellent ways for teachers to facilitate opportunities for our students to openly discuss questions, thoughts, and comments. In this next section, you'll learn 3 explicit oral language activities that will develop and reinforce our students' comprehension for narrative texts. The first oral language activity you can use on the Rica test is literature circles. This is where a small group of students will read from the same book, poem, or news article, or other text passage. Using this instructional strategy, the teacher gives a short talk about the text to be read and provides background knowledge in order to allow students to find a connection. It's all about building the connection between them and the text. Then the students read independently and they meet after reading a certain amount of chapters or a certain amount of pages, depending on level and age, as well as once they've completed the entire book as well. Then the students read independently and they meet after reading a certain amount of pages, chapters, or maybe even the entire book, and they meet to discuss what they read. The second strategy that develops and reinforces students' comprehension of literary text is called questioning the author. And this is where students read a certain passage and then the students discuss what they read by questioning the author using open ended prompts that the teacher will give, such as, what's the message of this passage that we just read? Or, what is the point of view of the author, do you think? Also, what evidence supports your point of view? And where could the author have stated the information a bit more clearly? As well as, how can we improve upon the way this passage was written? Now, let's go on to the third oral language activity, and that is still to promote students' comprehension of literary text. This one is called Think, Pair, Share. You may have heard this one before, and this is where the teacher who is reading a story aloud pauses at an important learning point in the story and asks the students a question about the story being read. The students think about their answer and then show the teacher a thumbs up when they have an answer. Next, the teacher instructs the students to share their thoughts with the student sitting next to them. Now, let's go on to writing activities for narrative books. In this section, we'll move from oral activities into writing activities that still develop and reinforce our students' comprehension of literary texts. Students will deepen their understanding of narrative texts the more they write about the books that they're reading. And the Rica test is going to want you to know that and show that. If on your Rica test you are prompted to share a writing activity to develop your students' comprehension of narrative texts, we recommend using a literature journal. This is where the students use their independent reading time to read silently, and then when they finish their reading session, they take a quote and a note from the story that they read. Or another option is to allow the students to write a summary. This all depends on the student's age and writing ability, as, of course, writing a summary will require a higher writing ability and level. For early finishers, allow them to draw a picture of what they just wrote, reminding them of the importance of detail to help retell the story. Let's talk about meeting the needs of all types of learners with respect to their comprehension of literary texts. For struggling readers, what we do is we can focus on key elements of story grammar, give them story maps, and help them using scaffolds. We can focus on key comprehension strategies and skills, reteach strategies and skills that are lacking, use a variety of concrete examples so they really get their hands on things and they can see what we're talking about, as well as providing additional extra practice. That's always really good for them. And to provide access to texts through oral presentations like read alouds or pre recorded stories. Now, don't worry because you don't have to memorize all of these strategies verbatim. Just think. Struggling readers will always do well when you give them tactile, kinesthetic methods that allow their five senses to be used, as well as giving them additional practice and focusing on key skills that are currently lacking. Remember, the Rica Test scores are always going to want to see that you give them practice and then you give them feedback about their practice. Now let's talk about our English learners and how to differentiate instruction for them. Here, we can clarify cultural context that might feel confusing to them, as well as pre teach key vocabulary prior to them reading the story that will be assigned. Lastly, for providing differentiated instruction for our advanced learners, that will include using more advanced or multiple texts, building on and extending their current knowledge, as well as extending the depth of assignments. Remember that the entire teaching process is systematic in that the teacher analyzes students' assessments to create both individual and class profiles. And it's these profiles that guide the teacher to design lesson plans in order to fit the individual student's needs, whereupon the teacher directly and explicitly teaches to the standard using the gradual release of responsibility model, using teacher modeling, using think alouds, where eventually the students are given practice to demonstrate their understanding of the standard that's being taught. And through this assessment, the cycle continues. Remember, assess, analyze, and teach again. You learned a lot in this lesson, so let's go over the key takeaways now. In this lesson, we reviewed the major genres that students need to learn, and we discussed effective ways to help our students recognize these major literary genres using real life examples by actually getting out, for example, a stack of historical fiction books or science fiction books and letting the students sift through them and providing read alouds to them so that they can really understand the difference between all of the different major genres. Next, we discuss the different parts of a story. This includes the introduction, conflict, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. And we mentioned that these parts of the story together are called, do you remember? The story grammar elements. Next, we discussed the three oral language activities that we can use to check our students' understanding of the stories. These three include literature circles, questioning the author, and think, pair, share. Remember, you don't need to memorize all of these, you just need to have a background information in case you get questions on your multiple choice section. But what you do need to have is a thorough understanding of one of them in case you get an essay question about it. Then we learned that writing is an essential part that helps students comprehend even more of what they're reading. So we can teach this using literature journals where the students read a text and then either write a quote and a note or summarize what they read. Finally, we discuss the importance for teaching to the needs of all of our learners. If providing differentiated instruction for struggling readers, use the five senses. If teaching to English learners, clarify cultural contexts and pre teach key vocabulary. For our advanced learners, provide more challenge, build on to their extended and current knowledge. Thank you so much for joining in this Rica Test lesson. If you're ready, go ahead, take the Competency 14 quiz, check your understanding, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.